welcome to the firm. Shell is calling it a tax on FDI. The Indian Tax Department says it's a simple case of underselling Indian assets, a disguised loan that should be subject to transfer pricing rules. Here's the backstory. In 2009, Shell India issued 87.63 crore shares to two parent companies at the par value of 10 rupees each. The tax department found fault with that valuation and computed their value through a revised DCF valuation at 183 rupees a share. It alleged that the undervaluation amounted to underselling of an Indian asset which compromises the asset base of the country. That Shell has brought short receipt of capital and loss on share premium to itself and thereby diminished the wealth of an Indian company. The transfer pricing officer calculated this short receipt of 15,200 crore rupees as a loan or receivable extended by Shell to its parent and deemed the entire amount receivable as tax, adding to it tax on the annual interest that should have accrued to such a loan. Shell has contested that claim in the Bombay High Court in a writ petition that says the transaction is a capital receipt and not a revenue item and hence not taxable under the Income Tax Act. A transfer pricing adjustment cannot apply to an item in the balance sheet. Even if a premium was received, it could not have been brought to tax. The transfer pricing officer has no authority to recharacterize a subscription into a sale. Fresh issuance of shares is not an international transaction. The definition of international transaction envisages only an actual receivable and not a hypothetical one. TP provisions do not provide for making secondary adjustments, that is, first consider issue of shares as an international transaction and apply arm's length pricing or ALP, and then treat the difference between the ALP and the actual price as debt accruing interest. The past few years have been littered with high-pitched transfer pricing cases, but this one is not just the most unusual, it could also potentially cost Shell 15,000 crore rupees in tax, the single largest transfer pricing case ever in India. Does the government have a legitimate case or is it creating an artificial tax event? To discuss that, I have with me Rahul Mitra of PwC, BM Singh, former CBDT chairman, and Rupak Saha of GE. Gentlemen, to all three of you, a warm welcome. Mr. Singh, I want to try and look at this from the revenue point of view, so I'm going to come to you first. Does an international transaction include share capital received from a foreign parent to or by a wholly owned subsidiary in India on the issuance of fresh shares, not a sale of shares to some other third party? And whether these shares were issued at 10 rupees or 183 rupees, Shell says they would never have been a taxable event. So had they sold the shares in the first place at 183, they still would not have been a taxable event. So that they sold them at 10 should not make them a taxable event either. What do you make of that?
You have summed it up correctly. You know, this is on capital account. It's the sale of a share. It's a foreign direct investment. And if there was a capital gain involved in sale of certain shares, one would have thought that, yes, we could step in with a TP adjustment. But speaking firstly, whether it is an international transaction, that itself appears to be slightly stretching the definition of 92B. But of course, let's for one moment say that it is covered by section 92B, as it is a vast, it covers just about every transaction with a, be it on capital account or on a revenue account. Having done that, then you go to the charging section of section 92(1), which says any transaction which has the effect of reducing the income of an SSE can be brought to a transfer pricing scrutiny and adjustment. In this case, like you said, even if they are charged at a higher rate of 183 rupees a share, the amount would not have been taxable in India in the sense that it would have been a share premium which would have gone to the capital account. So I don't think that the department has done the right thing to invoke the provisions of transfer pricing in such a case. It is a matter of other authorities to ascertain whether the amount paid was correct, the RBI guidelines, the control of capital issues and all that. But not for the department to step in and say that, oh, this would have amounted to an underselling of an asset, therefore it is an income. Okay, even if it is an underselling of an asset, is it an income? That is what the point is. Is it income in the hands of the SSE, that is Shell India? I don't think so.
Rahul Mitra, is it an income Can that capital receipt be recharacterized as an income? Is it an international transaction based on the expanded definition of international transaction emanating from last year's budget? What do you make of those core aspects of this case?
So, Menka, coming to the basic question as on the principal amount of undervaluation of shares. Now, there is no question of it being brought to tax. I don't think it's required to go into the definition of international transaction or not, because transfer pricing is all about valuation of the income or the expense, but not to say as to whether a capital receipt can be a revenue receipt. So any receipt first needs to have the insignia of an income, in the first instance, and then say whether you have received more or less. So if I have received less than what I should have for issue of shares, maximum my share account, my capital account would have been increased without any impact on the profit and loss account. So under no stretch of imagination, whether under any expanded or restricted definition of international transaction, can the shortfall be ever taxed in the hands of the Indian company who was issuing the shares as a revenue income.
Mr. Saha, how are you looking at this case, given that, at the very heart of it, the question that's been asked for several months is, can you in fact make a capital receipt a revenue item and attempt to tax it in whatever different manner or twisted manner that you try to do that? Whether you try to do that by expanding the definition of international transaction, you try to do that by saying that the undervalued portion is a receivable, can you do or recharacterize a capital receipt as a revenue item?
Look, I tried to look into this for quite some time, and honestly I can't find any reason which can support what the tax authorities have done, what it has. So yes, there is a capital versus revenue debate. The other issue is that, is there any benefit to either the Indian company to which the tax is levied, or for that matter even to the investee entity? I mean, who is getting any benefit from this entire transaction at all? The Indian company, if at all, it perhaps has received less money than what it should have, and therefore, if at all, it has suffered, and for its sufferance it is getting a tax bill. That's unbelievable. Let's talk about the foreign company. To start with, the foreign company never got a tax bill to start with. But even if it is argued that the foreign company made a benefit because, it invested less amount of money than what it should have, the question is that the foreign company, it was a 100% shareholder and it remains a 100% shareholder. Now, if there were 2 or 3 shareholders, and if one shareholder received value in an Indian company for less than fair market, then perhaps one can argue that, the value from the other shareholders in the Indian company passed on to the shareholder who received shares in less than fair market value. But here this is not the case. Here the shareholder in the Indian entity is a 100% shareholder. So he stays at the same position before the share issue as well as after the share issue.
Rahul, I was looking at this from an amateur point of view, and it struck me as fairly ingenious that the tax department may have seen all these share transactions take place over 2008, 2009, 2010, thought that they were taking place at values less than they ought to, but didn't have any way to be able to tax them. So what they do is last year pass a clarificatory retroactive amendment that expands the definition of international transaction to include receivable. Then they go back to all of these companies and raise demands saying that the undervalued portion is in fact a receivable, and since this new amendment allows us to bring receivables under transfer pricing provisions, we're doing so, and bam, you've got to pay us 15,000 crore rupees. Do you think, if you looked at this case from this point of view, that maybe revenue has some case?
So Menka, now we are coming to the second question on the imputed interest and what we typically call as the secondary adjustment. That means, if you have made a primary adjustment thereafter, and since there is an imbalance between the taxable event and the profit and loss and your accounts, and then you say as to how can you recharacterize the amount to say that now it is either it's a receivable or it's a dividend, depending upon how you look at it. Now the question is, you don't need to have an amended definition of international transaction, because as such loans, financial transactions, or anyway international transactions. But the question here is a little different. Question is, could the Indian revenue have recharacterized an amount to say that now this amount should have been received by you, and having not received it, now it is a receivable on which you need to tax, pay an interest. Now, as I mentioned, Menika, this is something called a secondary adjustment on whether you can make a further taxation on the primary adjustment which you could have otherwise done. And Menika, based upon significant researches which we have done, secondary adjustment is something which is not uncommon in the world. There are several countries, about 12 countries which I can remember offhand, who do secondary adjustments, but only where their domestic transfer pricing laws specifically or expressly permit them to do. Even the OECD has stated very clearly that the issue of secondary adjustment is best left to the domestic laws of the countries. Now in India, unfortunately, we do not have an express law for making a secondary adjustment. So in absence of an express law for making a secondary adjustment, I don't think that it is legally permissible within the framework of our transfer pricing regulations.
Mr. Singh, would you agree with that? And if we were to leave the secondary adjustment issue aside, though Rahul will argue that you can't quite do that, would you say that the tax department has maybe at least a sliver of a case if they are able to say that this is a receivable is an international transaction, and hence we can go ahead and attempt to tax it?
Yeah, it's a good thing that Rahul brought this up, because in my discussions I was told that earlier the tax department had what is being done as a secondary adjustment, they had done it as a primary adjustment, where the shares were sold at an ostensibly lower price. They considered this to be a loan to the AE, and they had a notional interest which they were charging, bringing to tax under the TP regulation. But the secondary adjustment, like you said, it is not expressly given there, but they can stretch the argument, say that this does affect the income of the Indian entity and could be brought to tax. But again, it's a very, very it's not so easily tenable for them to succeed in appeal in this case also, because like I was saying earlier, the shareholder is distinct. The company is distinct. They are two distinct entities. Now, whose asset is diluted? Is it the company's asset diluted? Who has taken the loan? Is it the shareholder or is it the company? One has to see about that also.
Mr. Saha, we're using a lot of jargon here, right? Recharacterization, secondary adjustment. So look at this from the revenue point of view for me and tell me, is there any chance that they may have any case at all? Are we missing something in this? Why aren't we able to see why revenue is pursuing not just Shell but several other similar demands with such fervor?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, at least none of us in the panel seem to understand what the revenue's case is, or for that matter, to be fair to the revenue, if press reports are to be believed, the law ministry as well as the AG seems to suggest that there is a case. But honestly, at least I have not been able to understand that. But even before we go to the issue of the secondary adjustment, I think your initial question was that, look, they expanded the definition of international transaction. I would say that they, by their own admission, they never expanded. They said that, look, all these transactions were within the ambit of international transactions, so therefore it was almost of a clarification, if you will.
Right.
But if you see the definition of international transaction, the essential definition of the international transaction under 92B1, I think, it clearly says that those transactions which has an impact on the taxpayer's profit, loss or assets, right?
Right.
So therefore, even if there is a retroactive expansion or a list of illustration, that entire list of illustration still gets circumscribed by this condition, which is that international transaction must impact either the taxpayer's profit, income, loss or assets.
But would you say the usage of the word asset there might give them some case in this situation?
And the question is how? This was a issuance of share capital. How would the transaction have an impact on the company's assets? I do not understand that.
I don't know. I'm not the tax expert here, but to stretch the argument, if they're saying that the asset has been undersold, does that give them then transfer pricing jurisdiction to look at this, revalue the asset and find a way to tax the undersold part?
No, again, as Mr. Singh correctly pointed out, the company and the shareholder are two distinct legal entities. It is nobody's case that the company is underselling its assets. The company is issuing shares. The company is not selling its property to its shareholder, so that one can argue about valuation, etc.